Eating is one of the most satisfying things we get to experience as humans, though sometimes we overindulge in it. Food fills us with energy and all sorts of important nutrients, but at the same time, it comes with all sorts of flavors that can make it an enjoyable experience, if you like the food that you're having, of course. But eating can also be one of the most dangerous experiences, especially if you have no idea what your food is or where it comes from. So, to keep you away from a deadly experience, we'll be talking about 15 foods that could kill you. You might be familiar with one at the top of the list, but I know you need a reminder just to make sure you're eating these foods the right way to avoid deadly incidents. Our first entry is mushrooms. Now, if the mushroom is called Death Cap or Destroying Angel, then you probably know that it's something you're not supposed to eat. But it's hard to tell when you find these mushrooms in the wild. After all, it's not like they come with a little sign that says their name. You gotta learn to identify them, so unless you're 100% sure that the mushroom in front of you is edible, you should stay away from them. There's actually this author named Nicholas Evans who almost died of liver failure along with his family after they ate one of those mushrooms of the deadly webcap variety. One time, 14 people got intoxicated after eating a death cap mushroom, and 3 of them needed a liver transplant, including an 18-month-old baby. Our next entry is cherry stones. And not just cherry stones, the same goes for apricots, plums, and peach pits. All of these pits release a chemical compound called hydrogen cyanide that is quite toxic to our bodies. A single dose of 0.1 grams can kill a person who weighs 68 kilos. A single cherry stone has about 0.17 grams of cyanide, so eating 1 or 2 of these could easily end your life. Now, the amount of cyanide is different in every cherry, so it's really hard to measure this. But why would you eat them anyway? Just eat the fruit and put the pit aside. Our next entry is cashew nuts. Okay, yeah, I know what you're thinking. Cashew nuts are sold everywhere. How come it's on this list? Well, cashew nuts are fine if you cook them before you eat them. So if you find them at your local grocery store, it's because they've been processed and you can eat them right away. But if you find them in the wild, you should just stay away from them. They have an acidic coating that could burn your skin, and they have this thing called urushiol, which is common in poison ivy. Eating so much of it can be deadly. And I mean, it's not like you'd eat poison ivy, am I right? So the same goes for cashew nuts. Don't eat them raw. Our next entry is ackee. You can find this edible fruit in its native geographical area, which is in Western Africa, but they also cultivate it in some parts of Jamaica. You'd actually be surprised by how delicious this fruit can be. In fact, in Jamaica, it's part of their national cuisine, but only when it's fully ripe. If you do eat it before it's ready, it can cause unconditioned reflux, hypoglycemia, and even death. And if that wasn't enough, its seeds can also be toxic, which is why the fruit is banned in the US. Our next entry is rhubarb. If you like pastries, you're probably familiar with rhubarb, especially when it comes to tasty British dishes. This plant really does add some special flavor to things, but stay away from the leaves. It's been said that eating them can cause you burning, breathing problems, coma, and even death just by putting them in your mouth. Granted though, it would take about 5 kilos of leaves for them to have a deadly effect, but you don't want to take the risk. So eat the stalks, and get rid of the leaves. And if you're not sure what the edible part is, just watch a video before you cook with it. Our next entry is kidney beans. Your chili wouldn't be complete without a proper portion of kidney beans, but only if they're thoroughly cooked. Otherwise, you're probably going to get food poisoning. Apparently, kidney beans have a substance that could kill you if you were to eat them raw, like many things on this list. That's why it's recommended that you boil them for at least 30 minutes before you even try to eat them. Time for our next entry, sanakchi. You barely hear about dishes that include animals that are still wriggling on your plate, and for good reason. But if you order sanakchi in Korea, you better get ready for that. This is a popular raw octopus Korean dish that you're supposed to eat while it's still squirming. The cook's gonna cut it into bite-sized pieces and mix it with sesame seeds and soy sauce. But by doing this, a lot of the nerve residuals will remain in the tentacles, which is what makes them wriggle on your plate. And if you're not careful, the octopus suckers might get attached to your throat. Our next entry is green potatoes. There's nothing wrong with eating potatoes. Either way, I'm sure you know that by now. But please, don't eat the ones that are green. They have a poison called solanine, which can cause severe illness if you ingest it in large amounts. The leaves, stems, and sprouts of the potatoes have these things called glycoalkaloids, which are common in plants that belong to the nightshade family. And if you're familiar with plants, you know that the substance can be toxic to the human body. Our next entry is peanuts. I guess you can figure out why this one can be deadly. It's estimated that 1 in 200 people are allergic to peanuts in some populations of the Western world. In the US alone, at least 1% of their population is allergic to peanuts. Some people get allergic reactions by simply inhaling peanut proteins in the air, and others get sick by eating other foods that were near peanuts by the time they were cooked. Allergic reactions include redness, swelling, itching, and digestive problems. However, in some severe scenarios, it can also cause breathing problems, which can be deadly if not treated on time. Our next entry is almonds. If you've watched my videos, you know that almonds can be beneficial to your health. But unfortunately, they can also be deadly. That is, if you don't eat them responsibly. When the almonds are bitter and raw, they're full of cyanide, which we already know can be toxic to our bodies. That's why they need to go through a proper process before we can actually eat them. And also, some people can be allergic to them, so they're not so beneficial if our bodies are not compatible with them. Our next entry is cassava. This root crop has become quite relevant over the last couple of years. People use cassava to make those tapioca balls, and they also use it for cakes, juices, and chips. But the leaves and other parts of this root can be toxic to our bodies. And that's because they have, say it with me now, cyanide. But poisoning can be prevented by properly cooking the cassava before canning it, serving it, or eating it. And there are 2 types of cassava. One of them is the sweet one, and the other one is the bitter one. The sweet one is not that dangerous, so you only need to cook it a bit to make sure that you reduce its level of cyanide. Now, if you want to eat the bitter one, you better make sure you grate it, soak it, and cook it properly before you eat it. The bitter one is the one that has the highest levels of cyanide. I wouldn't worry too much, though. There are guidelines all over the web that you can follow to make sure that your cassava is ready to be eaten. Our next entry is tomatoes. There's nothing wrong with eating tomatoes. Don't worry, though, you're not going to die by eating this fruit. Or vegetable. Or fruit. I don't know. However, the stems and leaves are an entirely different story. They're absolutely filled with that toxin called glycoalkaloid, which we already saw in the green potatoes. And like I said, this toxin can cause severe health issues such as problems in your stomach, cramping, and anxiety. So keep eating the fruit, but stay away from those stems and leaves. Our next entry is shellfish. This one is bad news to anyone who loves seafood. Apparently, between 0.5 to 2.5% of the general population can be allergic to shellfish, depending on age and where you live. For some reason, these allergies are more common among certain communities, and unfortunately it's one of the deadliest allergies out there. Shellfish include shrimp, crayfish, crab, clams, and oysters. And if you're allergic to them, you might experience vomiting, diarrhea, swelling of the throat, and shortness of breath. So make sure you know your boundaries before you start eating that plate of seafood you're craving. Now it's time for the day's best pick. Are you getting hungry by watching this video? Or do you think you might skip the next meal? Now don't do that though. You need to eat. Otherwise you're gonna pass out. But I can see how this video is probably making you less hungry and more conscious about how dangerous food can be. I bet you're a bit surprised by some of the items I mentioned today. But if you look at the picture I chose for today, you'll realize that it's showing a dish that most of us wouldn't be having on a regular basis. Actually, I'm sure many of you are never even going to try this in your life. With that said, though, the giant bullfrog. When it comes to frogs, people usually tend to eat their legs and nothing else. And there's a good reason for that. Frogs are full of toxins. Some people go as far as saying that their bodies are a minefield of toxic substances that could easily end our lives if we were to eat them. Still though, bullfrogs are a delicacy in places like Namibia, where people secretly enjoy this dish and buy it from the backs of trucks. That's because it's also an endangered species, but for some reason people love to eat them. And they're not as small as the frogs you see around you. They can be as big as 20 centimeters long. But in order to make sure that they're safe to eat, they usually get them after mating season, and after the third rain, which is when their levels of toxins have decreased. Now, if you eat them at the wrong time, though, you could get something called Oshiki Takata, which is a temporary kidney failure that will require immediate medical attention. Before we move on, do me a favor. My analytics show that only about 15% of you watching are actually subscribed. Come on guys, what's up with that? Can you guys please hit the subscribe button? You guys watch my videos every day anyway, so you might as well subscribe and keep up to date with every video we put out. Our last entry for the day, folks, is raw meat and uncooked eggs. Okay, yeah, this one isn't rocket science, but I still gotta say it. Raw meat and uncooked eggs can be dangerous for you. Now, I know it sounds obvious, but you really have to be careful when you cook these things. Red meat, chicken, eggs, and fish can contain a bacteria called salmonella, which can mess up your stomach. And salmonella can also lead to very bad complications that become life-threatening to those who have a weak immune system. The bacteria can even enter your bloodstream and mess up your system, so to avoid all these problems, it's better to carefully cook all these foods. Now, are you ready to get something to eat? I just hope it's something that's going to make you sick. Now you have this list of 15 foods to keep an eye on and make sure you're not eating anything harmful. Was there anything on this list surprising to you? Or maybe you know about other foods that can be deadly? Any other food allergies that we missed? Well, let us know in the comment section down below. With all that said and done, that's our video for today, folks, and I will see you all next time. Later, everybody.